Big round of applause for Montek Singh Ahluwalia, someone who's been intrinsically involved with India's reform story for decades now. And since we've titled this the 1991 feeling, turning today's crisis into tomorrow's reform, there's no better person than Dr. Ahluwalia to tell us his learnings and what they can really teach us in India 2025 leading up to 2047. Dr. Ahluwalia, let me start with what a number of political and economic commentators are calling 2025 and the tariff war with the United States as a potential crisis that could also create opportunities, much like 1991. Is there any parallel at all between what happened in 1991, when a balance of payments and a foreign exchange crisis forced us into reform, and what we are now facing in 2025 with economic uncertainty and these tariff battles?
Well, thanks, Rajdeep. I feel a bit like a Christian being thrown before the lions, having you on the other side. Look, every crisis creates an opportunity. I mean, simply because you face a difficult situation, you dust up whatever you think you needed to do, and it increases the urgency of doing it. This is not the same thing as saying it's a good thing that President Trump has done what he has done. Because quite honestly, all these things were necessary for us if we wanted to achieve the objective of Viksit Bharat. Because we've been growing for the last 20 years at least, at about 6.5%, give or take a little bit. And the objective that we had set requires us to grow on an average up to 2047, somewhere around 8.5%. And in order to do that over this long period, you must allow for some slowing down in the process. So the reference rate, maybe for the next 5 or 10 years, should be closer to 9%. So in that sense, being at 6.5 and having to get to 9%, even if you didn't have the Trump tariffs, was a challenge, okay? What this has done, of course, is it's got rid of the comfort that we're moving along at 6.5, and we need to do something. It's different, in my view, from 1991, because although in a deep sense, 1991 was a very immediate crisis because we just ran out of foreign exchange reserves, because we hadn't taken corrective steps for the previous year and a half. So we just couldn't have carried on doing what we were doing. Nobody was willing to lend to us. We're not in that situation now. I mean, the reserves are there, and if we don't do anything, growth rate will come down. It won't be exactly the same as running out of money, how to pay your import bill tomorrow. But it is important, in an important sense, it is a crisis because the 6.5 wasn't good enough. It wasn't generating the employment we need. And if we don't generate that employment, the internal tensions will increase. That's point number one. Point number two is that the world has become totally different from 1991. See, in 1991, that was a high point of successful globalization. We were the odd guys out. I mean, I wrote a piece at that time internally for the government, and I said, look, everybody else is doing this. We're the only ones that are not. It was easy to prove that we are doing the wrong thing because we weren't doing well. Today, the problem is that it's not clear how the world is going to move. It's not a world in which everybody is talking the same language. So the problem becomes more complex. How do you decide what is the right thing to do? And then there are two other complications which you need to keep in mind. One, technology. I mean, technology is changing much more rapidly. Technology has always changed, but earlier the change in technology took maybe a decade or so to take effect. Today, I mean, ChatGPT in about another year will be increasing its capacity by a magnitude of 2. So the rate of change of this technology is huge, and how are we going to react? What will it do for us? And the last one is climate change. We're not operating in a world in which the climate is going to be the same thing. That introduces new urgency. So quite frankly, it's not just Mr. Trump, although obviously he's drawing all the public attention. But yes, we have a crisis situation. We need to we need to take a good look at what our priorities should be in this situation.
Whether we use the word crisis, maybe we should then use the word challenge. Our challenge is, how do we move from 6.5% growth rate to 8.5%? Are you therefore saying that our preoccupation shouldn't be with what Donald Trump does or does not do with tariffs? Our preoccupation is to get our own act together here to ensure that our manufacturing becomes competitive enough, that our growth rates are sustainable at an 8.5%, which may provide more jobs, which may perhaps make us far more competitive in an increasingly uncertain global economy.
Well, let me comment on on these areas. One is very clear that what President Trump has done is upended the existing, if you like, rule-based trading system. There's no way of disagreeing with that. He's done it, okay? Now, obviously, he's done it because he thinks this is going to be good for the US. Most respectable economists around the world don't. In fact, they think what he's done will actually not make America great again. It'll actually fragment America's capacity. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't look like that because, you know, inflation seems to be under control. Growth in the US also doesn't seem to be that much affected. But most people say that the full effects of the tariff have not yet come in. So it is going to take about 3 or 4 months before the US decides whether what Trump is doing is good for them. I personally think it's not. But I think we have to look at it in the following way. There's no doubt that what the US is doing is acting like a bully. Now, they're a big boy, the biggest one in the block, so they can't afford it. But what should we do? The normal argument would be that when somebody acts like a bully, everybody else says, look, we're not going to accept that. Unfortunately, everybody is not doing this. All the big boys, EU, UK, Japan, you name it, they have all effectively kowtowed to the US position. And this leaves us in a situation where, how do we react? I don't think that we should be necessarily provoking conflicts. We should be doing exactly what we are doing, which is trying to negotiate with the US how good a deal can we get. And when you say how good a deal, it's quite absurd to be having high tariffs, even 25%, when the US wants much lower tariffs and faces much lower tariffs for themselves. Our problem is at the moment 25 could become 50. So hopefully our negotiators are trying to get as good a deal as possible with the US. That's the only thing to do, and wish them luck. But I think we need to do more than that. I think our trade strategy, we need to address the question. A lot of people are saying that the old idea of being open is wrong, that you should raise protectionist barriers. The Chinese have always done it, the Americans are doing it, etc., etc. I think that's wrong. I think we should be linking up with a non-US part of the world and saying, look, let's integrate and open up with each other. So in that sense, I think the UK FTA is a very good example. I think we should conclude an FTA with EU as quickly as possible. And I think we should also look eastward. Now, I can understand that there's a political difficulty in doing RCEP because our industry opposed, I'm told, I don't know, but I'm told, that industry was very opposed to any free trade agreement which had China in it because they feel China is difficult to compete with. But we could join the comprehensive progressive trade partnership, the CPTPP, which includes Japan, which includes Korea, which includes Australia, which includes other countries. Now, this would be a very major signal. Those who say that India is wedded to closed markets, if you want to give a signal that we are not, in my view, we should apply to join the CPTPP.
So we diversify our trade.
Hang on, CPTPP is not just about tariffs. Far too much of our intellectual thinking in the country is based on the assumption that open trade means lowering tariffs. But it also means harmonizing behind the border standards, which traditionally we have been very reluctant to do. Now, frankly, in the way the world is evolving, I think we should face the fact if other people are agreeing, if other people are doing an alignment of behind the border standards, then India should be willing to do it. And of course, you negotiate, you determine the time period, but that would give a clear signal that, look, the rest of the world wants an open system. The US doesn't. We would welcome the US joining when it's ready, but we don't just sit around building little walls around ourselves. And that is a big challenge for us to accept.
But in that sense, there is a parallel between 1991, because some of our traditional policies which were based around protectionism, of the so-called Bombay Club, which was resisting any kind of opening up of the economy, this provides us an opportunity, maybe, for example, to reduce some of the non-tariff barriers.
Yes.
It gives us an opportunity to look at trade well beyond the United States, which actually accounts for only 18% of our export basket. I'm just asking, in that sense, is it time for the government of India, and they've shown signs of it, to move away from the protectionism that marked a kind of Swadeshi approach in the first 7, 8, 10 years of the Modi government, to a far more opening up of the Indian economy now?
Yes, I completely agree with that. Look, when you say we did reverse our reduction of tariffs earlier, but I think the Modi government also said that we want to become part of global value chains. To that extent, the geopolitical tension between the US and China creates this famous China plus one alternative. If we want to benefit from that, we need to integrate with global value chains, not just sit there and produce everything ourselves. Now, in order to integrate with global value chains, we have to have a policy towards technology, investment, capital movements, a whole range of things. I think I would put it this way. What President Trump has done is he has, by unwinding or dismantling practically the established rules of international trade, he's given us an opportunity to think, what is the rules of international trade that we want? Are we just happy with multipolarity and everybody builds protectionist walls around themselves? Or do we want to create an integrated world with everybody other than the US, and then let the US join? I mean, there's no question that the US should be invited to join. Right now, they don't seem to be in a mood. What I worry is that the protectionism in the US will encourage many people in India to say, that's the way we should go. And I think that would be a great mistake.
You mentioned briefly China. You spoke about China plus one, and India almost becoming a competitor in a way to China as part of global supply chain. At the same time, there's a concern in this country of our trade deficit that we have with the Chinese. Would you believe China is to be seen as a competitor, or could China be a potential trading partner as part of a larger regional bloc that you just spoke about, like RCEP?
Well, look, longer term, I mean, China is the second largest economy in the world. And it would be in China's interest also to integrate with the world. So from that point of view, China, I mean, look, everybody's a competitor. So the idea that we'll only have trade deals with people who are not competitors is just wrong. I mean, really successful trade deals are between people who are competing, but you're competing at different levels of the value chain, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with China is, and with any country, all countries have security concerns, and they have to take precedence. Now, it's no secret that we are not on the best terms with China in this respect. How things will evolve in future, one can't judge. Therefore, having security concerns that in this area, we don't want imports from China because it compromises national security, not economic security, but national, that's understandable. But otherwise, quite frankly, the fact that we have a deficit with China, we should not fall into the Trumpian mistake of trying to have balanced trade with every country. As long as our overall trade deficit or balance of payments deficit is not a problem, I don't think we should look at individual deficits. Trump's biggest fundamental error is the belief that look at every country and devise a trade policy for each country which responds to whether you have a deficit with that country. This will get you 0 marks in Economics 101, or as Paul Krugman has said. And we should really avoid that.
The reason I'm pushing you, Dr. Ahluwalia, on how we should respond to what Donald Trump is doing is because protectionism for a long time was supported by the bureaucratic political elite in this country. I have your book with me backstage, which is your memoir, and you mention in that at numerous times, even in 1991, the roadblocks that you faced to actually push through reform, some of which came even from the Planning Commission, of which you later became deputy chairperson. There was a general sense that jo chal raha hai wo chalne do. That's been part of the attitude, to bring in the kind of major reform as opposed to incremental reform. A lot of our problem seems to be over the last decade and more, we've resorted to incremental reform rather than path-breaking reform that will entirely disrupt the system. How do you overcome that? How do you overcome the bureaucratic hurdles that remain when, for example, you want to remove non-tariff barriers? And there are companies which over the years have benefited from retaining those barriers.
Well, thank you for mentioning my memoir, because it brings out these things very clearly. Let me remind you that in 1991, the Planning Commission was not in favor of the reforms. I mean, I'd written a paper in the PMO which got discussed in the Committee of Secretaries. And the one group that said this should not have been done was the Planning Commission. They didn't oppose it in substance. They said, we are about to prepare an approach to the something plan, and why is the PMO writing papers like this? I think the real lesson is, at that time, I wrote this paper for VP Singh. It was originally meant to be done for Rahul Gandhi, but of course
Rajiv Gandhi.
Rajiv Gandhi. He didn't come back, so that was a pity. We had sort of watching for the election, and what VP Singh said was, look, let's send this to the Committee of Secretaries, okay, for discussion. Then the paper leaked. Huge discussion in the press. I believe that open discussion of alternative views helped people in 1991 to take a position. I think we need that always. We need that particularly in a world in which the problem is becoming more complex and multidimensional. As I said, technology, this, that, and the other. And I think that the idea that the bureaucracy is obstructive, I don't buy. If the political leadership is clear about wanting a frank discussion and can organize and see the consensus evolve, I don't think the bureaucracy would be opposing it.
Let me give you an example, Dr. Ahluwalia. The last budget spoke of a deregulation commission. Now, we are now 8 months from, or 7 months after the budget. We still haven't, the deregulatory commission has not been formed. Now, that leads me to ask the question, is reform by its very nature in this country going to be incremental? Whether a Donald Trump forces us to disrupt the existing order or not?
I greatly welcomed the announcement of a commission because it was different from we are going to deregulate. If you go back to 1991, one of the very interesting things that Dr. Manmohan Singh announced in his budget speech, he didn't announce the details of either the financial sector reforms or the tax reforms. But what he said is, I'm setting up a committee under Raja Chellaya to do the tax reforms, under M. Narasimham to do the financial sector reforms, and to report back by December. Those committees were notified within 2 weeks. Now, yes, they've delayed it, but I really hope that they actually appoint a commission. I think I've seen some conflicting information. Sometimes one hears sees in the newspapers that it's being done by a group of secretaries. That would be a mistake. Because a group of secretaries who've presided over a system which they haven't changed is extremely unlikely, just because they sit together, to come up with radical change. What you need is somebody outside, including some retired secretaries can be put in. Let them produce the thing in public and let it be discussed. So people judge, is this the real reform you need or not? And that's in my view, very important.
But it again comes back to it that when we want to reform, even in a crisis moment, we do it by stealth. reform in this country has taken by,
in 91 it wasn't by stealth. These committees submitted a report. The report was made public. It could be discussed. We could do the same thing now. I mean, I don't know whether the government intends to appoint a commission or just rely on internal processing. But if they intend to appoint a commission, the first thing that will happen, depending on who's appointed on the commission, they will carry credibility. They will be able to invite industrialists to come and talk to them. Industrialists will be freer in discussing with the commission what they want than they would be within the government. And then they come up with a report. Then we look at what the report says.
Dr. Ahluwalia, the Prime Minister in particular has drawn a red line. He said that I will do whatever it takes to protect the interests of Indian farmers. Now, one of the big sticking points for a full-blown trade deal with the United States could well be in areas of agriculture and dairying. Do you agree that given the state of our economy, given the fact that the farmers constitute a major constituency in this country, we will always need an element of protectionism for our agriculture and dairying sector?
I think, look, in every country, agriculture and farmers are politically very special. So I think the idea, if you're going to do reforms, I think there are a lot of reforms needed in agriculture. But I think you should not be doing reforms in agriculture seeing to be pushed by others. There are reforms, you should develop a consensus within. It would not surprise me at all if I hope our negotiators are telling our other side that, look, agriculture is a sensitive subject. Nothing is ever written in stone. But this is not something that should be done as a result of trade negotiation. Now, you know, there are always little things you can do because we do allow some agricultural imports. But the basic agricultural issues, including, I think, things like, let's say, allowing GM food. Now, you know, at the moment, we're not allowing Indian farmers to benefit from GM technology because we haven't made up our mind. So how do you concede allowing import of GM foods from outside if you're not allowing it to be done inside?
But I've heard many economic commentators say that agricultural reform is necessary. And yet, when the Prime Minister pushed ahead a few years ago with farm laws, he met with a backlash that eventually forced him to push back on those same reforms. So, is part of the challenge even now to build that political consensus first and then go ahead with the reform? Even in 1991, you didn't have a political consensus when you went ahead with the reforms. So what comes first, reforms and then political consensus? Or do you build a political consensus and then go ahead with your reform?
No, it's quite clear that nothing ever gets done simply in abstraction, okay? So where there are political problems, you need to work in advance towards solving those problems. I think we've left too many things in agriculture somehow outside discussion. And I think we need to have an internal discussion on that. I don't somehow think that these are areas which are best pushed through trade negotiations. In the trade area, there are other things we can negotiate, and that's where we should concentrate on.
We started off, or you started off by saying, you believe that the real crisis, if I may call it that, and perhaps this links to our Viksit Bharat theme, is to see how can we grow from 6% to 8.5%. Where would you start? If you were advising Prime Minister Modi or the government of India today, where would you start if you wanted to ensure that over the next few years we push from 6 to 8.5%?
Well, by the way, I would certainly say that what we are doing already in infrastructure needs to be done much faster and better, and it's the right thing to do. It's closing a lot of gaps. That's good. I think there's a lot of procedural things which affect logistics. You know, our procedures are sometimes quite absurd. And I don't know how, I mean, somebody needs to see whether in addition to infrastructure improvements, the procedures can be simplified. That's an easy one to do. What I've said on trade, imagining the world we're going to face in the next 4 or 5 years and positioning ourselves in a way in which we can actually contribute to creating a more open, non-US centered, with the US welcomed when it wants to, that should have very high priority. I also feel that, you know, there are certain sectors where, I mean, the ease of doing business, for example, which is being talked about. You know, Manish Sabharwal, I think, had done a very good report where he pointed out that there were 16,000 compliances required, half by the center and half by the states, which involved criminal penalties rather than just financial penalty. Now, frankly, I would say that, if the center wanted to give a lead, it could say, well, look, out of this report, these are the 1,000 compliances that are criminal. We've looked at it and we've cut them down by 90%. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you don't have a penalty. It's a financial penalty, not a criminal charge. And invite the states to do the same thing. If the center were to show that it is serious, there would be a momentum built up in the state, not just in the BJP states, but clearly in the BJP states, but in the non-BJP states. Half the things that are needed for ease of doing business can be done by the states, and we should do that. I think the reform of we've been talking about it for the last 3 or 4 years, that the GST rate structure, the GST was a great innovation, good that it came in, but the rate structure is simply not conducive to maximum efficiency, and what is more, everybody seems to have agreed. Why isn't it getting done? Maybe we need to set up another committee or commission or something to put something down which can then be publicly discussed.
What you're saying, Manish Sabharwal uses the word regulatory cholesterol.
Yep.
You've got to get that regulatory cholesterol out of the system. It was interesting in 1991, you had a minority government, which actually brought in some of these landmark reforms. Since then, you've had a government, certainly in the last 10 years, which has been, except for the last few years, a majority government. Is it easier to sometimes do some of the more dramatic reforms in a minority government or a coalition government because you almost need those reforms to brand or pitch yourself distinctively to previous governments? And a stable political government, ironically, can take its own sweet time because it's politically so strong.
No, there's some truth that I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have majority governments, but it's certainly true that if you have a minority government, and if the top people in the government are convinced that they have to do reforms, they are much more moved to build a consensus. And there are ways of doing it. Look, when the reforms are done, the left was totally opposed to the reforms, so were parts of the right. And what Dr. Manmohan Singh did was he got about 4 or 5 people to write a piece defending the proposed reforms and why they're a good thing. So I think we need a more active debate. The idea that reforms are going to come because in a budget speech, the finance minister is going to announce reforms is not, I think, the way it should be done. I think we need to create a reasonable debate so people are more aware. And of course, that means that those who oppose them will oppose them. The other point I want to mention here, which is very important, there is competition now among the states. And I think in many, many areas, including, by the way, farm laws, states might well want to do things which others don't want to do. If you make this into a national affair, then you make it into a national crisis. If you make it an individual state affair, you may find that some states are able to get things done which others are not able to do. Now, if those things work well, then there will be a natural tendency to emulate whoever's succeeding.
In a sense, you're saying move away from over-centralization where Delhi knows best and start giving far more autonomy to state governments to take some of the key decisions they need to. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Look, our states are at very different levels of development. The ratio of per capita GDP between the southern states, the hiring and Gujarat and so on, and say the eastern states, 5-to-1. So in any country, if you had a 5-to-1 difference in per capita GDP, the priorities would be quite different in one compared to the other. And the only way this will be allowed to surface is if the states have a much bigger say in defining their own strategy.
As we enter the last part, you've had this vantage look at the Indian economy over the last 3.5 decades and more. 3 things that the Narendra Modi government has done that you would applaud and 3 things where you think they've either got wrong or they need to do now.
Okay, well, applaud.
Spirit of bipartisanship.
Yeah, I'm giving a bipartisan view. Look, by continuing the Aadhaar initiative, which actually began in the previous government, which the BJP had opposed, and at one time it wasn't clear, but the present Prime Minister quite early on said, no, Aadhaar must continue. And then this whole financial build-up, DBT, etc., I think it was a very good thing. And over this period, it is an area where we are recognized to have done well.
That's one.
Point number 1. Point number 2 is getting the GST through, which, by the way, he himself opposed as State Chief Minister when the previous government was trying, but to his credit, he got it done when he was Prime Minister. I think the problem with that is that the most important thing about the GST is simplification, and that has not been done. Let me give a very simple, not just the number of rates. Why on earth is it necessary, if I'm operating in 4 different states, to be registered in 4 different states as a taxpayer? I mean, surely in a world where we are talking about IT, etc., that should not be happening at all. So that we need to get that done, simplified, cleared up, etc. I think that introducing the IBC, the bankruptcy code, was a very good idea. And it's still a work in progress because it gets involved in courts. But it's sending a signal that, look, you can't just keep borrowing from the banks and never repaying. It hasn't yet become smooth enough, but it's a good thing. Things that I don't think were right, raising customs duties in 2017 was a mistake. We can correct it now by taking a totally different approach to trade policy. But this will require persuading people in industry that it's in our interest to open up, because there are people saying that, no, we should go the protectionist route. So that, I think, is a very big problem. I think, finally, the issue of how much flexibility does the center give to the states, this will become more and more of a problem. And my guess is that the more central government assistance to states is tailored to conditions designed by the states but subject to some government approval would be better than detailed designing by the center, which the states then have to implement.
That's an interesting note on which to end this conversation, because our next precise discussion is on center-state relations. By the way, before we started the conversation, Dr. Ahluwalia had an interesting point, which you didn't mention. Why aren't our railway platforms, right, in the private sector? Am I correct? That you would like, you don't want to see, if airports can be privatized, why wouldn't railway platforms? But you'd get a lot of backlash then from railway unions, as you get when it comes to labor reform. So,
we had a lot of backlash from the public sector bank unions when we got computerization done in 1993. So the fact is, unions will do what unions have to do, but you have to A, persuade them, build a consensus, and in due course, there's a deal that can be done.
Okay. On that positive note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've listened to someone who's had the wisdom of being in government for many years and being an intrinsic part of the reform process. Dr. Ahluwalia, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia, and thank you so much, Rajdeep. May I please request you to stay back on the stage while I request Mr. Siddharth Zarabi to please come up on stage, Group Editor Business Today, to present a token of appreciation to our special guest. Let's have a warm round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Dr. Ahluwalia.